Hey everyone, so this is going to be the recording for the last unit in Patient Care 31. It's going to be Pharmacology. There's a lot of information in this unit, and even the details I have here in this note doesn't really cover everything that's in the slideshow. The actual test material doesn't really cover everything. It's kind of going to be a theme or a unit that we're going to revisit throughout the course in Patient Care Theory 2 and 3. So I've added as much or quite a few details that aren't really going to be tested on this test coming up, but you can kind of go through it as you want because a lot of it's going to start to have to deal with the ALS and some of the medications we give. So I thought it was kind of pertinent to have it at least shown you and presented. So it's all included in here. There's some stuff again that's in the Moodle slideshow that's not on this presentation, but we'll definitely talk about it throughout the rest of the course. Um, I'll highlight some of the stuff. If you check your emails, I have the review sheet that's already been sent out. So if you kind of follow along with that, you should be able to find most of the big topics and themes that are going to be on the test coming up later this week. All right, so we'll get to this. It shouldn't be hopefully too long. Again, there's going to be some of the content we'll kind of skim through, but yeah, we'll see how long it takes. So we'll start this off with kind of what's the goals of pharmacology, or what are we trying to do with medications or certain treatments that we give, and whether it be in the pre-hospital setting or in the hospital environment, we're trying to either prevent, reverse, or control various disease illnesses or their symptoms that they're presenting with. And I added here that it's important to remember that some medications that we give or some of the treatments we provide don't actually reverse the disease processes. It'll just simply kind of mask the symptoms. So it'll be symptom relief only. So if you look at like pain management medications, antipyretics for like fevers and stuff like that, um, things like bronchodilators, sometimes like they can reverse asthma, but it doesn't actually cure asthma. It's just kind of opening the airways. Or analgesic medications will relieve the pain, but it doesn't actually cure the tissue damage. Antipyretics will lower somebody's temperature, but um, it doesn't actually cure the infection or whatever is actually causing the fevers. Medication errors are one of the leading causes of patient safety problems or concerns in the healthcare field. There's a lot of kind of mix-ups that can happen when you look at like vial types, medications names, like compounds and chemical names. So a lot of them can kind of start to sound really similar or have similar spelling of names. So it's really important, and you'll learn this in skills class, that you do really good cross checks and medication checks with your partner before you give any medications. And we're going to go through a few kind of skills and stuff that we can use as far as a self check to make sure we're doing the right things before we give any medications. So it's important to remember that any medication we give can be poisonous if it's given to the wrong person or with the wrong dosing. We're going to talk about therapeutic indexes and stuff that will kind of help us have an indication on what levels would be safe or not safe and what can kind of change those levels. And then final thing to remember is when we give medications or anything we do that's considered to be a delegated act or a controlled act, it's actually, we're not operating under our own license. So we operate under the license or the direction of a medical director, or what we call as a base hospital physician. So at the end of the day, they're giving us permission to operate under their scope and give the medications and the treatments that we give. So when we look at medicine and kind of where we are today, it's important to kind of remember, not that long ago, when you look like even medieval times and, 17th, 18th century, the concept or the idea of like viruses and bacteria wasn't really well understood. So medicine back then was a lot more of kind of a broad blanket treatment of symptoms and less of a specified actual kind of understanding of an illness process or an infection. So it says here, second point, treatments were kind of centered on counteracting presenting symptoms. So you look at like if blood was found or phlegm, they're trying to treat like things with black bile, yellow bile. So you'd find like kind of like very broad symptoms, and they would do things like burr holes in your head, or there's things like lobotomies, bloodletting, like kind of these weird archaic remedies that you hear of. That's kind of like a showing of their not really well understanding of the body systems and things like infectious processes. And again, thing to remember, like things like microscopes and microbiology, that wasn't really understood either. So hand care, cleaning, wound treatments, and stuff like that, like sterile environments wasn't really um, well practiced methodology. As you move into like the 19th century, 20th century, more effective medical compounds are discovered. People are looking down microscopes now. They're able to see there's small little pathogens and stuff that actually move around. White blood cells fight off infections. So there's obviously a lot better understanding of how the body works and how our immune system works, and exactly what's causing infections and what is causing certain disease processes. So it's more of a targeted practice nowadays. So one of the big things we kind of run into when we talked about medication errors and stuff is the naming of medications or naming conventions, and it's going to be something throughout this program you're going to kind of have to learn certain conventions or common things that you'll find between similar drug groups and what their naming conventions would be. All names and any medications or cleaning supplies, pretty much anything that's listed in these three categories here, is controlled by what's called the Health Products and Food Branch. So anything that's involved with diagnoses, treatments, prevention of diseases, even if we look at devices, cleaning supplies, anything like that, it's kind of all monitored under this branch of government or oversight body, you could call it. And they're also kind of in charge with deciding on which of these compounds are going to be available over the counter and which ones have to be controlled or available by prescription only. So before a drug makes it to the shelves, it has to go through research and development. That's time that pharmaceutical companies spend, and money they invest into having research trials done, clinical trials done, actually having biologists and chemists develop the compounds, make sure they're safe. So this can take years and years, sometimes even decades to get the process finalized to the point where it's a kind of a concept to it's an actual on the shelf medication. With any kind of research and development, so when a pharmaceutical company actually develops a new medication, they'll retain onto a patent for about 20 years or so. And then after that point, it becomes a generic availability. So they can, the compound can be distributed through any other company. So you see things like Tylenol, it would have been developed by a proprietary company, and then at some point it would have been made available for anyone to use, and then you would have whatever equate acetaminophen or whatever companies want to really put it out. So there's other generic brands you'll see, and it's usually a couple decades after the release of the initial medication. One of the kind of things that make it tricky with our field of work is that we can kind of run into a few different these naming systems as medications kind of age or become mature, I should say. So they'll usually start off with a trade name. That's usually the name that the companies that develop them want to put out, and kind of it's their kind of commercial name for the medication. So it's a unique name which the manufacturer registers for the new drug. So I put down Tylenol here, and with a question mark under it, 'cause I'll explain that in a second. But to start things off, when you're registering the drugs, it's always kind of given a chemical name, which is the actual chemical makeup of the medication. If you were to say that to a chemist, they'd be able to say, okay, I know exactly where the certain atoms are in this molecule. So I'm using acetaminophen for all these, and the chemical name for that would be 4-hydroxyacetanilide. It doesn't really roll off the tongue really easily. It's kind of a difficult one to really say easily. So generally what happens is they'll create what's called a generic name, and this is kind of derived from the chemical name. So there's usually something you can kind of find that's common between the two, and I've underlined it here. So it's the aceta part, and again, for Tylenol, you're looking at acetaminophen, which is kind of like the over-the-counter name. If you're looking at different cold medications and stuff, you'll find, it'll have 500 milligrams of acetaminophen in it. It'll never say 500 milligrams of Tylenol because, again, Tylenol is the trade name for that specific brand only. And then, again, finally, the trade name would be what's found unique only to that manufacturer. I wanted to add this in because it wasn't really in the slideshow that I could find. It's what's called orphan drugs. So these are medications that are typically used to treat extremely rare diseases, something that wouldn't typically be very profitable for any pharmaceutical company to actually develop on their own. So usually what happens with these is they're developed with either government or public funding. So if you look at certain, fundraising groups that are, trying to raise money for a specific disease, typically it's because certain pharmaceutical companies don't find it really profitable to invest on it themselves. So it's the kind of the way the public sector will push to have certain medications developed, hopefully. So when we look at the development of medications, they typically come from 4 different sources. It can be animal, plants, minerals, and laboratory. The big one for animal that I can always think of, or microbe, is the production of insulin. So there was, for a long time we would use what was like humulin, which is basically a human-derived insulin type, but it was basically, there's some altering done to, it's usually I think it's pigs, and they'll actually have the pig develop human insulin, and then we kind of extract it from the animal. There's also a lot of other medications that, microbes, process certain bacteria, can create products that we use as medicinal agents. Plants, the big one is opiates. If you think of fungal things, that's the antibiotics. Minerals, you got vitamins, electrolytes. And then finally, synthetic medications or drugs, which are from the laboratory. Fentanyl's a big one, but there's a lot of kind of designer drugs and stuff that come out, which are strictly just synthesized in a lab setting. Good thing to look up if you're ever looking for information on medications or drugs is something that's, got a proven source. So these two are the ones that typically show up when I'm, doing research on medications, or what their what do you want to call it? Like their pharmacokinetics or their duration and stuff like that. Like you can get a lot of information from these websites. So Medline Plus is a U.S. government funded kind of database of medications. And then drugs.com, it's public, but it's used by a lot of research institutions, Harvard, Mayo Clinic, and all of them use drugs.com. So both of these, I'd say, would be reliable online sources you could use to look up information. So the Food and Drug Act was developed in 1920, and it governs the sale and advertising of foods, drugs, any kind of products and devices in Canada. It had some revisions done in 1985, but it's kind of the overseeing. So the FDA, right? So if that's what, decides how much caffeine can go in an energy drink, or who can buy energy drinks, or that kind of stuff. They oversee all that sale of anything that's kind of a food or a health product. In 1996, they developed what's called the Controlled Drugs and Substance Act, and this is what governs any kind of controlled substances. So you look at like narcotics, cannabis, tobacco, stuff like that. And they've divided it all into what they call 8 schedules. There's a lot of them that you can see I've crossed out that are no longer really applicable anymore. I don't know why they wrote 8 on their list, because there's actually 9, but I guess they removed one when they labeled them as 8 schedules. So there's actually only 6 active schedules at this point. So schedule 1 would be your narcotics. So you're looking at opium, morphine, fentanyl, kind of like those sedation medications, right? The ones that people are getting high on the side of the streets, those kind of things. Number 2 is your cannabis, cannabinoids. So whether it be oils, edibles, anything that has cannabis in it. Schedule 3 will be your stimulants, so you're looking at amphetamines, hallucinogens, LSD, and it's important to remember that when you look at stimulants like this, it's not like your designer drugs, which are kind of like the street versions of them. Class 4 would be your anabolic steroids, barbiturates, which are in the sedation class, and then benzodiazepines, which are also in the sedation class. They're kind of used for, when somebody's having a seizure and we have to give them something to kind of stop the seizure, prevent the seizure. It's also used for sedation of agitated patients, so it's kind of in that class. I'm not really sure what the relation is between the benzos and the anabolics, why they're in the same class, but they are. So I said class 5, not applied anymore. It's kind of a deprecated class. I don't know why they just don't move everything up, but class 6 would be your precursor and designer drugs. So you're looking at like MDMA, meth, kind of like the street drugs, those kind of synthetically made ones that aren't actually developed by like pharmaceutical companies, for example. Classes 7 and 8, they're again deprecated, no longer applies. Don't have to worry about them. The last one would be a class 9, which is any device that's used to make a tablet or a capsule. So any of those, they kind of look like a press, but basically press either a powder into a tablet shape, or you can have a little capsule, press the powder or a gel into the actual capsule. So standardization of doses, this is what's used to ensure that we always give the same amount of prescribed medication in a drug. This is what we see when we have problems with overdoses in the streets, because these medications, if you look at like opiates, for example, which whatever they're going to be cut with, they're usually put into a blender, for example, and they'll blend the medication with the other substance they're cutting it with. And it's usually not going to be an even blend of medicine and the additives. And what happens is some people get a stronger dose because it's not always evenly mixed. So standardization of doses when you're looking at pharmaceutical grade medications is always ensuring that you're going to get the same dose per amount of drug given. A few important terms to kind of remember from this is assay. So that's an assay of a medication is the analysis of the actual potency. And then bioassay would be the determination of the actual concentration of that drug that's going to be active on a tissue or, enzyme, cells, whatever, a part of the body, basically. So assay is the potency of the drug on its own, and then bioassay is determining how concentrated or how strong it's going to be in the body or in a tissue. So commercialization of a drug is basically taking it from, like I said, that kind of concept R&D stage to on the street being sold, not on the street, I guess, but being sold and available in the hands of consumers or, patients who might need it. So it says average time for R&D to approval is about 9 years, depending on the medication. Can take longer, but it has to go through all these trials here, these kind of steps. So it's going to start off with animal trials. This is kind of used to test tissue sensitivities, possible allergic reactions, if there's going to be any problems with enzyme conflicts, those kind of broad, really severe reactions that you wouldn't want to have happen to a human when you get to the human testing phase. It's used to assess the drug's pharmacodynamic and pharmacokinetic properties. And in the slideshow, they discuss this a little further on. I just put it in here because it's kind of something that reoccurs throughout this presentation. So pharmacodynamics is the study of a drug's molecular or physiological effects or actions. So it's also known as the mechanism of action, or how the drug actually works. And it's basically looking at factors that may alter the intended response or side effects or kind of undue effects of a medication. Pharmacokinetics is how the body's going to interact with the drug for the entire duration of that exposure. So how is the drug getting absorbed and how is it getting secreted? There's duration of action. Kind of the best way to look at these is, for me anyways, like I said, I always try to split these words up. It's pharma is your medication and kinetic is the movement of that medication through the body. So you're going to take the pill, it's going to go in through your mouth, Your stomach's going to break it down. It's going to get in your intestine. It's going to get dissolved into your intestinal wall. It's going to get picked up by your bloodstream. It's going to get circulated to your liver, where it's going to get filtered. And then from there, it's able to get recirculated into the general blood supply, and whatever, to the muscles or to whatever tissues it has to go to. Eventually it's going to get metabolized, sent back into the bloodstream, sent to the kidneys, where it's going to get secreted and urinated out. So that'd be the pharmacokinetic of a certain drug. And then the pharmacodynamics of the drug would be, how is it broken down at the cell? Is it going to cause certain enzymes to act inappropriately? Is it going to cause white blood cells to act inappropriately? So that's like the dynamics of the medication in the body. So after the medication's gone through the animal trials section, and kind of they've determined that it's not going to cause any untoward effects, hopefully, on humans, they introduced to what's called the clinical human trials, which goes through 4 phases. The first phase is it's tested in healthy volunteers. So before they start giving it to people who are sick, they're going to make sure it's not going to cause adverse effects in somebody who is healthy. They want to make sure somebody who has a fully intact immune system, no other comorbidities to start off with. They want to make sure it's going to be fine with that population. Then they move on to a homogeneous population. So that's usually a group that has similar characteristics. So whether it be somebody who's has an illness, or somebody, it's usually something that's similar between all of the groups. So there's not really any wide variables between them. And they typically do what's called a double blind test. So double blind test means that the person who's getting the medication, they don't know if it's an actual medication or what's called a placebo, which would be just a fake pill. And the double part of it is the person who's giving not the person who's giving medications, but the person who's running the test also doesn't know who's in which group. And it kind of prevents any sort of bias or, what they call placebo effect in the actual patients, right? So if nobody knows who's getting what, then we can determine, unbiasedly, if the drug has, a positive effect or not. Once it passes through that stage, it gets, made available to wider groups, and that kind of continues over years. So you'll see doctors will be able to start prescribing it, maybe, or doctors might be involved in clinical trials and be able to submit certain patients towards receiving the medication. And then the final stage or phase of the trials would be examining the long-term efficacy of a drug. So if it's something that somebody's going to have to take for the rest of their life, or if it's something they can take it for 5 years and be cured, and that's going to kind of add into the cost effectiveness of the medication. During this process, each drug is given a unique identifier number. It's kind of like a serial number. If you look it up, you'll see it on if you go to drugs.com, for example, they have it listed under every medication. It has its own ID number. And then the last part is I added here is physicians can gain access to what's called a special access program, and certain practitioners can actually access medications that might not be available on the Canadian market. So say if you're combating a very a rare form of cancer, an autoimmune disease, and we've exhausted all the methods that we have in Canada available to us, but there's a study going on in the States that's, proven that might help that certain illness. We can actually petition to have these medications brought in for certain patients, and it's usually kind of like the last ditch effort. Like we've exhausted everything we have here, so we're going to, reach out and try this other methodology. So again, when you're looking at like the paramedic part of giving medications, or our treatment plans, this doesn't really have a huge role or play into effect kind of like our thought process for that. This is kind of a nice understanding, especially when you look at like medication errors and stuff. But it's a good idea to have an understanding on, what's behind pharmacology and what's, kind of gotten the medications into your hand that you're going to be administering to the patients, especially when you look at things like our naming schemes and stuff like that. You want to be comfortable with these things here. The Schedule Acts, I believe that's on the test. I have it in the review process as well. So as with any topic in healthcare, we have special groups or special considerations we have to have for certain patients. You can probably already imagine the three I'm going to talk about, but the first one is going to be the pregnant patients. Again, mom's physiology and anatomies changed drastically, and we're worried about potential harm to the fetus with medications that can cross over the placental barrier. The big thing we're looking for or concerned with is what's called teratogenesis, and that's the effect that a drug can have on a developing fetus. So a lot of things can actually pass through that barrier. So the big thing is, like fetal alcohol syndrome is a big one, and then things like opiates can actually have effects on the unborn fetus while it's still in utero. So a lot of the times, I mean, for us with our ALS documentation, it has all those considerations already built in. Where, is the patient pregnant? Okay, no, you can't give it. Things like that, right? But when you're having, even conversations like for me with having a young family, there's a lot of times that my wife and I have had conversations like, what can she take? What medications are safe for pregnant people? Or even if you're going to a call and you go to assess a young pregnant woman who's maybe their first pregnancy, and it might not be something that you're bringing to the hospital. They're just scared, or they're feeling ill and they want to get checked up. They might have questions for you about what's safe to take as a pregnant mother, kind of thing. So having an understanding on certain medications or certain kind of cautions that we should observe with pregnancies might kind of give you a little bit of insight to those situations. So risks still exist even after birthing the patient or birthing the baby. You're still worried about breastfeeding if they're doing that. If not, then it's not something you're so worried about. And certain medications even can take into effect reproductive potential. So that would be an effect for male and female, while males can't be pregnant, but certain medications can kind of cause problems with reproductive organs. And again, just important to remember that if you're going to give any medications, make sure that there's nothing that's going to cause any problems or any ill effects to the fetus. Make sure you do it before you administer it, hopefully. Second group, pediatrics. So they have what's called a reduced metabolic capacity. So they're smaller bodies. They don't have as many cells that are metabolizing. So reduced metabolic capacity. They don't have as many proteins in their blood. So medications typically float around freely. They're not bound to other things in their bloodstream, which means they're more readily available to be absorbed and used. Their metabolism functions quick, so the cells that are metabolizing will use up that medication pretty quickly. And the last thing is a juvenile GI tract, so their gastrointestinal system. They're really slow to absorb things, so medications will stay in their intestinal tract a lot longer than it would for an adult who has a pretty active GI system. And our final group, geriatrics, and again, they're really, most of these situations pretty comparable to young children when you look at some of the mechanisms. Their GI activity and metabolic rates are usually a little bit lower, so these medications are going to stay in their system a lot longer. They can tend to build up. Something that's hopefully not going to be happening with pediatrics, though, is geriatrics typically on a number of different prescription medications which can have interaction with each other, or they can even kind of act in similar mechanisms which can cause problems. Geriatrics typically have a low body fat, which means again, medications that are being administered don't really have a lot of places to kind of diffuse to, so they'll work right on the tissues that are gonna present with symptoms. So somebody who is larger, for example, would that medication would have more places to kind of dilute into or diffuse to, whereas somebody who's emaciated only has a small amount of muscle, and then the rest is kind of their core tissues. That medication is going to be really concentrated on those tissues alone. And the last point I put here is geriatrics have a potential of accidental overdosing. They can sometimes be forgetful, so we do a lot of things like blister packs, those kind of pill reminder plastic things that they use. So certain ways to help them remember that if they've already taken their medications or not. So when we go to calls, a lot of times we'll, take a look at their medications, count their pills, or look at their blister packs and make sure that they haven't taken an extra dose or they haven't been missing doses, because their compliance. So I actually don't have that written in here anywhere, but compliance, and you'll hear this in the hospital as well, is their ability to kind of, follow their drug routine. If they're compliant with their medications, it means they take them as prescribed. If they're non-compliant, it means um, they're not taking them as prescribed. In your textbook, there's a table. It's just table 7.3, and it goes over some of the common med errors that we would see in the hospital setting. So some of the big ones, they have kind of each one listed out. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because you can go through it at um, your own leisure. But these ones you usually won't see, like these medications names. We're not really worried about actual chemical names, but things like SC and like IN, people get typos all the time with, if they meant to put IV and they type IN or stuff. You'll see that a lot on our documentation. The more important ones that we deal with when we're actually looking at giving medications is actual like numbers of the doses. So for example, like this intended meaning was 4 milligrams, and they say a possible interpretation can be 40. So sometimes what you'll see is people write medications like that, and if you just look at it quickly, you might misinterpret that as 40. So one of the things they say is write it like this, 4 milligrams. That way there's no zero there to get confused. And the same thing can be the opposite opposite direction, right? So if you have 0.8 and somebody misreads that as 8, make sure you have like a 0 before the decimal point. Don't just put 0.8 milligrams like this. Some of the other big ones though, I'm trying to think, like so we have diamond hydronate. It should be an E at the end. So medications that are spelt the same or have similar letters in it, they can be confusing too. So diamond hydronate is your gravel medication, and diphenhydramine is Benadryl. But there's a lot of medications that kind of have similar things like this, and they typically go through what's called, like, I think they call it tall man or tall letter. I think it's called tall man spelling or tall man. I think it's just called spelling, but you'll look at like medications, like they'll do, and they'll actually write it like certain parts of the word will have all capitalized letters, and that's to kind of force your eyes to see the certain parts of the words that are spelled differently. So legally, we're responsible for the appropriate use and documentation of medications when we're dealing with the ALS and medications we administer. Um, and it's important to remember too, just because might be your partner giving the medications, because they administer it or they mix up the medication or whatever, it's not just their, like, we're both legally responsible to ensure that we're providing the safe use of our ALS treatments. And that's why it's important that we understand, precautions, contraindications of these medications, and, look out for certain interactions and problems that can arise from their administration of them. I wrote down here contraindication, and this is a finding or, a vital sign, for example, that would kind of exclude somebody from a certain treatment. So certain contraindications we'd have for most medications is if they have an allergy to it, they're contraindicated, which means they're not going to get that medication. We're responsible for understanding proper techniques, whether it be how to give the medication, sharp safety, aseptic cleaning techniques. We're responsible to know the effects, side effects, and we should be understanding the pharmacokinetics and the pharmacodynamics of these medications. This part is going way back, all the unit 1 there. You want to get your incident history, patient history, kind of get that whole sample picture before you give medications if you can, which will help you, fully understand if this person's going to have any possible reactions or complications from your treatments that you're going to provide. And it's important to remember, every patient has the right to refuse a treatment or an assessment type or anything like that. This is all bearing in mind, though, that the patient is actually of sound mind. If they're, severely confused or intoxicated, I wouldn't really say that they're going to be able to make a, sound clinical judgment. And if you get to those patients and they're, combative and not wanting to be, seen or assessed, that'd be one of those situations where you might call, the police or call your base hospital physician and have that conversation with them. So now we're going to actually look at the pharmacology and how it works on our nervous system. This plays a big role into a lot of our different medications. Its effects on kind of nerves and certain nerve pathways. Certain medications can kind of intercept the kind of like the neural highway and, stimulate it or depress it based on certain characteristics. So just a quick overview again. I think we've talked about this a number of times. You've already gone through the A&P of it. So you got your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system. Your peripheral nervous system takes care of your somatic nerves, so your things you're consciously able to control, muscles, all that kind of stuff, speech. Also has your autonomic nerves, which is your kind of systems you're not able to control kind of consciously. Ganglia, so that's kind of a, what's a good way to think of that? Ganglia is kind of like a bundle of nerves, or where nerves kind of group up together, kind of makes like a little nodule, and it's kind of like a hub or a little control hub, I guess you could say, where certain signals can kind of propagate and then get sent back out to different areas. So that's all ganglia is. Remember, we have afferent and efferent nerves. I've kind of written in a way that works in my head to remember them. Afferent is away from the brain, efferent is coming back or entering the brain. Your peripheral nervous system has your fight or flight response, and also your parasympathetic and your rest and relax responses as well. Certain medications can stimulate the release of hormones and neurotransmitters. I'm not sure if you've gone through the A&P of the neurons yet, but I'm going to touch on it real quick here just so we're all on the same page. Certain medications can also prevent the production and block reabsorption of these hormones or neurotransmitters as well. And we'll go through this image here real quick. So it's important to remember, when you're looking at how neurons work, the signal through a neuron from the head all the way to the dendrites, that's kind of an electrical signal, right? So that sends an impulse, kind of jumps down here, goes over the down the axon, goes past the myelin sheaths if it's a myelinated neuron. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. But as it gets sent down here, it gets to the I don't know if we'll just keep it here. It gets to the synaptic cleft, and then it actually turns into a chemical signal between the two neurons. So I've kind of zoomed in here. So if you think this is where the actual signal is coming down from, you actually get to the kind of the dendritic end, and this is where there's a lot of these neurotransmitters that are kind of housed in these little vacuoles. And what happens is, when the signal gets sent down, they'll actually get pushed towards the end of the presynaptic membrane, which is again the nerve that's sending the neuron that's sending the signal out, and it'll actually push these little vacuoles to the edge of the membrane, where they'll release their neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters, what their job is to attach to these receptors on the adjacent cell. So they has to cross the synaptic cleft, which is this space between the two neurons, and attach to these neurotransmitter proteins, or the receptor proteins, sorry, which will then activate the next cell in that chain. So when we look at certain medications, they can actually mimic these neurotransmitters, and they can also inhibit these transmitters, which I'll talk about in couple slides here. And this can be done either by preventing these vacuoles from actually releasing their neurotransmitters, or it can actually kind of cap and block these receptor sites. So in our nervous system, we have two major types of receptors. We have what's called nicotinic receptors, and these are found in a lot of our tissues. They basically work at neuromuscular junctions. So if you look at a neuron that's attaching to a muscle, which is this great little drawing here, it's going to be right in this area. So it's what's releasing onto the actual muscles to kind of stimulate those muscles to contract. So you can see here things like heart rate increase, hypertension. So if you think of vascular constriction, mydriasis, which is the dilation of your pupils, so that'd be your iris, actually the muscles in there getting contracted. That's your nicotinic receptors. The other major one would be your muscarinic receptors, and these are typically found kind of in non-somatic tissues that we have no control over, but they're throughout the body, kind of what are used from neuron to neuron. They're kind of like the intermediate receptors, and they typically run off what's called acetylcholine and muscarine. So you can see here they tend to have the opposite effect as the other neurotransmitter, or the receptors. So just remember acetylcholine and these symptoms. We're going to talk about them again shortly here. So when you look at medications and their effects on the body, they can only influence certain functions that we already have. They cannot obviously give us new functions. They can't add any kind of new metabolic pathways or like that. It's only going to be able to really stimulate or block things that are already there. So we have what's called an agonist, which would be a stimulation of a response or a receptor site. The opposite of that would be an antagonist, which would be the kind of suppression or the depression of a receptor site. Medications like this have a certain affinity and efficacy. So affinity is the actual attraction of a medication to a receptor. So if you think of, I'll just sketch it out real quick. I don't know why I didn't do this earlier. But I always just think of, like, let's zoom in over here. If you have a receptor, and I always think at the end of the day, these are all just different proteins and stuff, right? And you have, we'll say, a medication, and the medication comes along, and the protein has, you know, say negative, 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 positive, positive. You know, it'll probably still attach to that, but it would be happier if, like, this one was positive. It'd be the exact opposite, and it would pretty much stick right onto that receptor site. So basically, a medication that has more of a suitable pairing to a receptor would have a higher affinity. And then efficacy is basically the ability for that medication to actually trigger that receptor or produce a result at that receptor site. So that's an increased efficacy. Medications come in a wide variety of forms. Obviously, we have, you know, most of these we give in the ambulance or in the pre-hospital setting, and these are going to kind of, you know, elicit different modes of action or kind of onsets of action. So in liquid forms, you're looking at, you know, there's quite a large list of them. They're not all really going to be relative, or they're not going to be really important for the pre-hospital setting because we obviously don't give milks and tinctures and stuff like that. Just going to try and find here it is. So the important ones to look at, I would say, would be, you know, things like a solution, I don't even know, let's say syrup, suspensions. But I'll go through them really quick here. So solution is basically a liquid that contains one or more chemical substances that it's entirely dissolved. So it's typically water. So if you look at, pretty much any medication we give that's in a liquid, whether it be something that you're going to inject or something that you're going to give orally, the medication's been dissolved in, it's typically sterile water. Suspension, it's um, almost the exact same thing, but it's usually a powder of some sort, and it's been kind of suspended in the drug. So it's usually not dissolved, but it's in there as a suspension, and this typically wouldn't be something that you would inject. Fluid extract is a concentrated form of drug prepared by dissolving a crude drug in a liquid. I'm listing the actual definitions here. Again, I probably wouldn't expect you to want to memorize all these. It's kind of not really useful for us. Again, but a tincture is a dilute alcoholic extract of a drug. A spirit is a volatile substance that's dissolved in alcohol. A syrup, this is something you probably know, is drug suspended in sugar or water to improve its taste. So if you look at like cough syrup, for example, it never tastes good, but they always say it does. Elixir is solution with alcohol and flavoring added. Milk, aqueous suspension, and an insoluble drug. So an aqueous suspension, this would be something like something that's not going to ever break down. So you have to kind of blend it up right before you give it to somebody. An emulsion is typically with a liquid that's broken down into another liquid. So it's usually blended together, and you have to consume it right away as well. So it's something that if you let sit, it'll kind of re-separate and you'll end up with layers again. Liniments and lotions, these are prepared for external use only. So these would be oils and stuff like that. Solids. It's just not going to let me go all the way over here. Okay. So an extract would be a concentrated preparation of a drug that's made by putting the drug into solution and evaporating the excess solvent. So that'd be, taking something like a suspension, for example, or a solution, and evaporating the fluid off it and being left with just the concentrated medication. Powder is something that's been ground into a powder, pretty straightforward. Capsule, these ones are good to know, so we actually give these. You probably want to know this one as well, and that. But a capsule is a cylindrical gelatin container, so it's got like a, something on the outside that's actually protecting the inside medication. So things like, I'm trying to think, if you've had those Tylenol rapid releases, Advil like gel caps, NyQuil gel caps, like the ones that you're actually able to feel like a waxy coating on the outside, those are going to be your capsules. A tablet, on the other hand, is the actual medication of the powder is just compressed into a small disc or a pill shape. Pulvule, sorry, I skipped that one. It's similar to a capsule, but it's not made of gelatin, and it does not separate. Never heard of that before. Suppository is a drug mixed into a base that melts at body temperature, so it's typically some kind of wax of some sort. These are usually, inserted into the rectum, vagina, or urethra. So you're looking for medication that has a direct response to those areas. Ointments are something that's semi-solid and put on a tissue typically, or surface of the skin. And then the final one is a patch. So it's usually a medication that's been kind of impregnated into the patch, and once it's adhered to the skin, it slowly releases it across the skin surface. And finally, our last one would be our gaseous medications. These are mainly things that are used for like anesthesia. We don't really have any gaseous medications that we give except for oxygen, if you want to count that. But as far as actual medications as a chemical, we don't really have anything that we administer. It's in a gaseous form. Trying to think. We have what's called a nebulized medications, which would be typically a liquid, but when it gets nebulized, it gets kind of turned into a vapor form. and that's inhaled by the patient. And then we also have what's an MDI, and that's actually a almost like a powder. It's under compressed gas, which would be like your puffers. Those are inhaled as well, but that technically would fall under a powder form. Um, but again, not going to be something that's going to be too something you have to worry about too much in the pre-hospital setting. So when we look at these different routes of medications, again, important to remember that these are going to affect the rate of absorption. When we look at something like, say, for example, we're talking about like a tablet or a suppository, that's a medication that has to get put in a rectum or something like that, and it's going to have to melt. The rate of absorption is going to be a lot slower for that, versus say something that's injected directly into your arm via IV or intramuscular route, for example. So these different routes will kind of change the speed the drug is like bioavailable. So bioavailable or bioavailability is how much of the chemical is actually available in the bloodstream to be used. So here's your definition of it right here, bioavailability. So how much of the drug is still active and available at the time it reaches the target tissues. So here's a table. We talked about this a little bit before when we're looking at some of the medication stuff, but this table has, things like you look at oral routes of medications, you're looking at least 30 minutes, and then you're at your fast and your IO and IVs, you're looking, within under a minute. So these should be pretty much straightforward. There shouldn't be too much of a, mystery behind why these are the way they are. When you look at something like an IV, it's getting injected directly into the bloodstream. It doesn't have to pass through your gut lining or anything like that. It doesn't have to be dissolved. It's already just available in the bloodstream to be used right away. Whereas something like an oral medication has to get broken down in the stomach, has to get moved into the intestine where it's going to finally get absorbed, and then has to pass through the liver, gets kind of processed there a little bit, and then it's finally in the bloodstream for use. Some things to remember though when you look at things or the way we have certain medications used is you can have either a local effect or a systemic effect. So a local effect would be something that you'd have a direct application to a tissue. So if you look at like say Rub A535 or Amul gel, or even things like salbutamol for bronchoconstriction, we are looking for local effects from those medications. You're inhaling salbutamol in the hopes that it's going to affect the tissues in the upper airways and cause bronchodilation. Things like A535, you're wanting that warming effect on the tissues that you're actually spreading it on, whereas other medications you want more of a systemic effect. So injectable epinephrine, for example, for anaphylaxis, you want vasoconstriction, you want bronchodilation, you want the heart rate to increase, contractility to increase. You're hoping for more preload to kind of fight those shock states. So it's important to remember that too, like certain routes of medication that we administer might depend on the certain action or effect that we're looking to achieve. So when we're looking at administering medications, we kind of have two large groups that we use to describe different administration routes. So we have the percutaneous route and the parenteral route. And if you're trying to remember which one's which, I always think of percutaneous. So you have a cuticle or cutaneous. I always think of like subcutaneous would be right below the skin. So percutaneous is through the skin or passing through the membrane of the skin. So this is anything that's actually getting absorbed directly through a skin or through a mucous membrane. So this is going to be anything absorbed through, it could be sublingual, it could be buccal, nasal routes are kind of like the big mucous membranes. Nasal administration is really popular now with Narcan administration. We use it for reversal of opiate overdoses. Sublingual you'll be using for Zofran for nausea, vomiting for those patients. And the important thing to remember is that most mucous membranes, if you remember the AMP of it, they're highly vascular because these membranes are usually involved with some kind of secretion of fluid or absorption of another fluid. So they tend to have capillary beds that are highly vascularized and able to absorb medications pretty quickly. In this classification, we also have the pulmonary route, which would be either could be directly absorbed through the lungs, or if you look at things like salbutamol, for example, it can be absorbed directly into the bronchioles or the mid to lower airways to relieve asthma symptoms. We also have medications like croup, which not medications like croup, medications like epinephrine, which we give for croup, which is also inhaled and goes through the pulmonary route. This route's usually really good for these medications because obviously it's going to bring that medication right to the area where it needs to do its work, or the area where it needs to have action. And then the last one is going to be I don't even know why I have that on there. Whatever. And the last one's going to be the enteral route. And this seems kind of weird because you're thinking, oh, well, if you're eating the pill or you're ingesting it, it's not really going through a skin or a mucous membrane. But I always think, I don't know, my A&P teacher always kind of explained it this way to me, and always kind of stuck. If you think of somebody, it's going to be a really quick drawing here. Right, so if they have your mouth hole, goes down through your esophagus, into your stomach, into your intestines, and finally out through the rectum. If you were to do a sagittal cut down somebody, you would inevitably have hole, whatever this would be. But that hole is continuous through the body, right? It never has any direct opening with like blood vessels or anything like that. So it's still considered outside of the body, even though it's a tube that runs through the middle of your body. So if you got through a sagittal cut, there'd eventually be some point you would cut through a mid-sagittal cut and you'd end up with two halves of the body. It would actually split in half because there's, through that whole tube, there'd be a point where you'd get a slice where there would be two halves of the body. So I always think it's, yes, you're ingesting the pill, but it's still considered outside of the body until it's actually absorbed through the GI tract. And again, there you can have oral medications, which we give, Tylenol, Advil, aspirin. Those are the big ones. We also give glucose paste for hypoglycemia. But then, in the medical world, there's also rectal medications, which are typically given for specific local effects. If you look at like stool softeners and enemas and stuff like that. So the second category is parenteral routes. And these are the faster ones. These are the ones that we're generally, injecting a medication directly into a tissue. And this one's kind of a tricky one because I always had the mix up of it has enteral in it, so it has to be the alimentary canal, or you're dealing with the enteral routes. But it's the exact opposite. So parenteral would be like without using the enteral route. I don't know how you want to memorize that, but so it's just anything but enteral. So you're going to be doing injections, all that kind of stuff. That's what the parenteral routes are going to be. So again, you're going to be using needles, syringes. Here are the routes that we're looking at, though. The IV route is going to be the most rapid. One thing to remember, though, when you give medications through this route, the medication is going to be immediately available at whatever dose you've given. So there's no way to really meter it. Once you've given it, it's in there, and it's going to be circulating and doing what it's going to be doing. The medication is going to take effect. It's going to bypass the GI tract and making it directly available to organs and tissues. The nice thing with this is when you give a drug this route, you're not going to really have to worry about, how much is it going to get broken down in the GI tract? Is the GI tract motile enough to actually break it down? Are they going to throw it up? Like that kind of stuff, right? The dose you administer is the dose that's available to the patient. The IO route, it's very similar to the IV route. Recent studies have actually shown that the IV route's actually a little bit more effective, especially when we look at cardiac medications, because it tends to circulate back to the cardiac tissues a little bit quicker. It's not really a huge margin, but there's been some studies at base hospitals said that it's preferable. Um, so onset's similar to IV, but there's arguments back and forth for each way. You only see this with an ACP. It's not something that's done by PCPs, and we try to only do it if we can't obtain an IV access. Intramuscular route, or IM, this is going to be a longer onset. The actual medication is going to be injected directly into a muscle tissue, and then that medication is going to have to actually diffuse or be absorbed from the muscle back into the bloodstream. Medications put through this route, they usually have a longer duration of effect or a longer duration of action, which means the medication doesn't get brought right into the bloodstream right away, so it has kind of a slower absorption and longer course of action on the patient. One thing to remember, though, that these patients have to have good perfusion to those tissues for it to work appropriately. So if you're injecting it somewhere where there's signs of poor perfusion, you're not likely going to have the effects of that medication show up in the patient's system. Finally, we have sub-Q, so it can be SC or SQ. I think most common right now is SC. This is injected into the fat or connective tissues directly beneath the skin, so you're not going to get it into actual muscle. So most times you see when people are doing sub-Q injections, they kind of pinch the skin up and will inject it into that kind of pouch of tissue. This is absorbed very slowly. You see there, most of these kind of peak around 30 minutes or so. And this is typically done in the upper arm or the front part of the thigh where there was some fatty tissue. You can also do it in the abdomen. It's typically where people get their insulin injections if they have a history of diabetes. So absorption, this is the transfer of medication. The goal is to reach a therapeutic concentration of medication in the body. Again, rate and the extent of the absorption actually depends on the ability for the cell to reach the blood circulation, but it also depends on its ability to cross a cell membrane. So certain things like, if the medication's kind of tied to a fat molecule, for example, it's going to have more difficulty moving through a cell that, maybe doesn't have the ability to transport fat molecules across the cell membrane. There's certain mechanisms of absorption that we have to be familiar with. So active transport, this is actually something that's moving a molecule across the cell membrane. This is what insulin does to get into a cell. It's what insulin does to get glucose into a cell. So insulin kind of will hang on to glucose and brings it into a cell. Whereas if glucose is just floating around on the outside of the cell by itself, it can't just passively diffuse itself into a cell. So it needs insulin to kind of mediate that or bring it across the cell membrane. Passive diffusion, on the other hand, is just something that'll happen regardless. It won't, doesn't need any help. It just passively will move on concentration gradient. Having a properly functioning circulatory system will greatly enhance the rate medications can be absorbed. It stops it from just stagnating and staying in one area at a high concentration. So medications are inevitably going to have to pass through non-target cells. So these are cells that aren't going to actually be intended to have the medication used on it, or they won't have an effect with the medication. And then once it passes through these cells, it's going to get into the bloodstream and finally circulate to the target area where it's meant to act on. So big ones are skin, mucosa. There's intestinal tissues, even things like capillary beds, things like that. So the important thing when you're looking at topical medications, if you're dealing with a large surface area, the greater the amount of a certain product can get absorbed through it. So if you're trying to absorb something, the same medication will absorb quicker if it's spread across the whole area of here than if it was spread just on that. And you got to take into account things like single layer, multi-layer tissues too, which I've kind of drawn a quick little drawing here. So if you have a medication that's, say we have medication sitting up here, it's the same amount and all this. So it's gonna, take a certain amount of time to diffuse through these cells here, but then it can free flow down and have a direct effect on these tissues pretty quickly. This one, it's going to have to pass through these top cells, and then it can free flow. But then, say if it gets to, the stomach lining or another capillary bed wall or something like that, and it has to diffuse across another membrane, it's going to take significantly longer for that second diffusion process and to get that medication to that target cell. And the same thing kind of happens here too when you look at more layers of tissue. So it's got to get through 2 layers of cells and then another layer. So think of layers of cells is going to slow things down. So that's when you look at patients that have, larger amounts of adipose tissues, muscle mass and stuff like that. These medications sometimes have to go through multiple layers of tissue to actually get to the area where they're supposed to have their intended effect. And again, going back to basic chemistry, when you deal with things in higher concentrations, they're going to get absorbed more quickly. So these medications, if they're in a high concentration somewhere, they're going to want to go down that concentration gradient into a low concentration area a lot quicker than if it was a low dose of the medication. So yeah, the higher concentration in the body, the greater the absorption is going to be. So this plays into the concept of what's called a loading dose and a maintenance dose. So sometimes when people start new medications, doctor will put them on what's called a loading dose, which is typically a higher or a larger dose than what's normally taken by a patient. And this is to help the body accumulate a certain amount of the medication, to a therapeutic dose or a therapeutic point where the drug's going to have the intended effect. And the goal of this is to basically overcome or exceed the body's rate of elimination. So you want to ingest the medication quicker than what the body can eliminate it out or secrete it out. A maintenance dose, on the other hand, is a smaller dose that's meant to maintain that concentration in the body. So typically it'll match or be slightly above the elimination rate to kind of keep that therapeutic dose or therapeutic concentration in the body. As with a few other things we talked about, pH will affect the absorption of medications. pH affects a lot of things in the body. But if you think about medications as being a chemical, having the pH kind of manipulate the actual makeup of the molecule will obviously change its availability or ability to actually attach to its intended receptors. Yeah, I think that's all for that. Distribution of medication is a process of actually moving the medication through the body. Obviously, the blood's going to be the primary distribution vehicle for that. If you're taking a drug through the like an oral route, for example, then you're going to be dealing with the GI tract as well as far as distributing it. But yeah, for the most part, you're looking at the blood tissues to circulate these medications. Two different types of, or two different classifications of medications, I guess you could say, or the medications transported under two different classifications. So free drug, this is basically what the body can use. It's not attached to anything else. It's just free flowing in the bloodstream, and it's available to interact and attach to receptors or cells that they're intended to. Once they're free floating like this, it says here, yeah, they can bind to fat, muscle tissues, and bone. Plasma binding or plasma bound medications, they can't be used by the body. It has to get rebroken down into a free drugs. It sounds so weird to say that. It has to be a free bound drug. I don't know. I'm just gonna call it free drug, I guess. One thing to think of though is with these plasma bound proteins, they'll lower the concentration of the drug, and they can actually get secreted from the body without actually being used. So they'll be just kind of wasted. So albumin, which is a plasma protein in everyone's blood, it does not leave the bloodstream; it stays in there. So any medication that gets bound to that protein will kind of stick around and get stuck there, and um, remain in circulation, and then it can free up after a while too. So it doesn't mean it's permanently stuck to it. It just it'll stay bound to that albumin for a certain amount of time until it decides not to. One thing to take into consideration too is with um, patients like alcoholics and infants, they typically tend to lose or have lower amounts of albumin. So if you look at somebody who has, you know, a normal amount of albumin, the dose that would have an effect on them might require a higher dose medication, whereas infants and alcoholics who have lower albumin, if you give them that same dose, they'll have more of that concentrated medication free flowing through the body and not attached to any proteins. Things that might also prevent distribution would be endothelial cells, capillary cells, patients who are pregnant, and then children under the age of 1 have less of these plasma proteins than older children. Trying to think here. Pregnant patients, they'll have, you know, higher proteins in their blood volume, so they'll, you know, require probably more dosing of the medication. And then the capillary endothelial cells, if they're not properly perfused, they're not going to have proper distribution as well. Biotransformation is basically the body's ability to metabolize and break down medications or make them usable by the body. You know, so there's some points, you know, when you ingest a medication or it's injected, it might not be active right away. It actually requires some kind of a metabolic process in the body to kind of activate it. One thing that's important, like we talked about in the last little chunk there, free drugs are the only things that can be biotransformed and made active. So once they're bound to a protein or something else in the plasma, they would either have to be, you know, removed from that protein to be activated, or they'll just become unusable concentration of the medication. So we have what's called here prodrugs. So these are basically engineered medications that only become activated after biotransformation. Some drugs will be activated right away. So you think of like opiates, they don't really require any processing in the body. Whereas something, trying to think of a good one. I can't really think of anything. There's some medications that will require processing in the liver to kind of adjust the chemical makeup of the drug for it to become active. This can take into account how we want to administer the medication. Certain medications will require this, what's called a first pass effect, which is basically it's passing through the GI tract to get processed by the liver. So I highlighted here that all blood from the GI tract, so if you think your intestines, it gets basically accumulated together and goes right through the hepatic vein into the liver, where it gets filtered, and then that's where this first pass kind of enzymatic processing happens, and then from the liver it'll get secreted back out, and then it gets sent to systemic circulation. So medications that require this first pass effect, they'll only be able to be given through a through the GI tract or through a percutaneous route. Finally, excretion of the medication. Biggest um, the biggest way their body gets rid of this kind of leftover drug compounds or unused drugs would be through the kidneys. It's got 3 different processes. It's got the glomerular filtration. So if anyone remembers, I'm hoping you guys do. Your glomerulus is that little piece of blood vessel that kind of looks like a bird's nest there. It's a massive bowl of spaghetti. And it's what actually secretes the fluid and waste product into the nephron. and then the nephron catches that, and it's basically going to run the fluids down. Going to go through the tubule, going to go through the loop of Henle, and through this process, the body kind of decides what enzymes, what medications, what glucose, what water it needs to keep or secrete. So this would be your tubular secretion and then reabsorption processes right there, which are listed below it. So this is the last kind of part about the actual drug effects. And then we're going to get into actual medication classifications. So there's four main mechanisms for drugs to have actions. The first one is binding directly to a receptor site. And this is the most prevalent one. This is, a medication is going to have a direct effect on either a cell or a receptor and cause the effect that we're looking for. This can be split up into either, again, an agonist, which is going to stimulate a receptor site, or an antagonist, which is going to block a receptor site from being stimulated. And I kind of drew it like pretty basic as I could, but you think of it as, an agonist is going to come and attach itself to a receptor, which is in blue, and it's going to tell that receptor to secrete a certain product or do a certain action. Whereas an antagonist, I kind of drew it here as like a cap or something that's blocking it. And then the normal, receptor or the normal neurotransmitters can't actually bind to it and can't do the effects that were normally done by that cell. So I kind of drew a little sketch over here. So again, we're looking at that synaptic cleft. And if you look at your receptors here, if we're looking at like a neurotransmitter or some kind of neural response, that's where we're looking to have these effects typically. These changes or these modulation of the receptors will actually change the amount of available receptors for use as we supply medication. So we have what's called downregulation. Basically, as we have medications bind to receptors, the actual amount of available receptor is decreased. So you have downregulation decreases the amount of receptors that are available. Whereas upregulation would be a medication that either makes more receptors available, so more receptor sites available, or makes them more easily to bind to. So the easiest way to just think of that is downregulation is less receptors, upregulation is more available receptors. These can change the other four mechanisms is either going to change the physical properties of a cell. So that can be something like the cellular membrane, maybe a protein on the outside of it that's going to change how much of the glucose it absorbs, or how much sodium it absorbs, or something like that. Other medications will combine with other chemicals, which usually is something that's going to take kind of a function in some kind of enzymatic pathway. So it'll kind of take the place of something else that might be missing in the body. And then the final one will be alter a normal metabolic pathway. So if you look at something like glucagon, for example, that's just basically taking the place of a normal metabolic pathway, but I'm trying to think of a good one. Anyways, there's not a lot of medications that we're going to give that do any of that. So most of the ones that we're worried about are the first one there. So through research and development, basically in studies, research has kind of shown like what a good dose or what specific concentrations of medications will do to a patient. That's why they develop what's called a therapeutic index. So they'll be able to kind of, determine what the upper limit and lower limit of medications are that can affect a patient. And they'll help us anticipate what the side effects are, risks and benefits, and, what the actual gap would be between those two. I think I talked about those over here, yeah. So this is what's known as a drug response relationship. So it's going to correlate the amount of medication given and the response that it causes. And it kind of has a window, and each medication has its own kind of window here, but that's what's called the therapeutic index. So, and this is going to change based on the patient's, age and, all that stuff. But basically each drug will have a toxic level, which would kill a patient, and then what's called the minimum effective level, which is the minimum amount of medication you have to take to actually notice the effects of it. And then that whole, range between the upper and lower limits was called the therapeutic index. And that's where we're hoping to kind of operate in most of the time, or all of the time, I should say. So a few other terms I wrote down here that are kind of important is onset of action. That's the time the drug actually takes until the minimum effectives is reached. This can also be affected based on what route we give them the medication, obviously. Duration of action is how long the medication can be expected to provide the intended action. Termination of action is how long until it stops working, basically. And then half-life is the amount of time it takes for the body to eliminate half of the amount of the medication. So we're going to chat a little bit about kind of sensitivities or untoward effects of medications, or maybe unexpected responses. So these are called iatrogenic responses. So these would be like hypersensitivities, right, where the body is responding either more acutely or more quickly than we'd expect, or it's having symptoms that are kind of amplifying the effects of the medication. Or on the other hand too, it can be responding negatively to the medication in some way. So we have what's called idiosyncrasies, and these are unique responses specific to a certain patient. So very kind of abnormal responses really specific to a certain person. Terminology is tolerance. So it's a condition where the patient becomes resistant to a medication, or is basically having to require to take more and more to have the same effect. Cross tolerance. This is kind of a unique situation. But say a big one is with opiates. We see this all the time. Is if a patient's receiving morphine, for example, they might require larger than average doses of another analgesic, or what they have Vicodin here, to get the exact same effect that the Vicodin normally would have. So basically, it's tolerance from one drug caused by a different one. Tachyphylaxis. This is a condition where the patient rapidly becomes tolerant to a medication. I don't really know what the actual mechanisms are behind this, but it'd be some kind of a response to likely some kind of downregulation of receptors that's causing the patient to become more resistant to that drug, or more tolerant, I should say. So terminology for minimum concentration is the concentration needed to become effective in the body. And didn't have this written down anywhere in the slideshow, I don't think, but any medication we give over a long period of time will kind of, patients will kind of develop a dependency on. So this will modulate, upregulation and downregulation of certain neuroreceptors. And if you all of a sudden take away that medication, it's going to be deprived of either stimulation or, that environment where the receptors had kind of modulated towards. So if you take the medication away, all of a sudden they'll have usually severe symptoms, nausea, vomiting, seizures, shakes. They usually don't respond quite well to sudden cessation of medication. When we're looking at patients who are on either their own prescription medications, or maybe patients who we might be looking to administer multiple medications to, we have to worry about interactions between different medication types or medications of the similar type. So we'll talk about a couple of these right now. So the first one is called summation effect, and that's basically just an additive effect. Like if you took two medications and they had a same effect, and it was just a combined total of what their desired effect would be. And then after that, synergism. So this is a little bit different. So it's two medications which may have a same or a similar effect, but when you give them together, they actually give a an effect that's greater than what both of them. I don't know how you really explain that. Like, here, let's just do it as a quick little drawing, so just everyone's on the same page. So let's say if you gave, you have Tylenol and you have Advil, and this one made you feel that much better, and this one made you feel this much better. So a summation effect would be you gave them both together, so you feel whatever both of those together would be. That'd be summation. Synergism is basically saying, so this is what actually happens with Tylenol and Advil, is they work together and they are actually able to kind of boost each other's effectiveness. So instead of getting that amount of relief, you might get something like, say, that would be synergy. So they kind of boost each other's effect and are able to kind of provide even more relief than both of them would together if they didn't have a synergistic effect. On the other end, we have potentiation. This is, you give two medications, but one only boosts the effects of another. They don't both get boosted. It's just one drug does a lot better with the other one helping it out. And then the last one is interference, which is the exact opposite. Basically, one kind of blocks the other one from working appropriately. I just put right here too, when you look at medication storage and safety, there's a lot of things to take into account, but things like storing them in direct sunlight, hot and cold temperatures, keeping them dry. It's pretty straightforward. And we should always be in mind, keeping them in a labeled container with the drug name, the concentrations, and all that stuff on it. It's not really much I should have to tell you guys about medication safety and storage. Just be aware that medications that are sitting out in the direct sunlight or in the heat will actually can break down and not work appropriately after a set amount of time. So this is the last part, is the medication classifications. I started numbering them, but I realized the slideshow doesn't really follow them very well, so it kind of just doesn't really follow any specific numbering scheme. Just I wanted them to be available to kind of see easily where one starts and the other one ends. I'm not going to spend too much time going too deeply into this because we're going to talk about this throughout the rest of the course too. But I just wanted you guys to have an idea of, that medications are broken down into these groups and kind of having a starting to build a bit of a map on what medications do what and what classifications it might fall under. Let me just move this maybe over here. So the first big group is analgesics and antagonists, or analgesic antagonists, I should call them. So these are typically going to be for pain relief, analgesia, and what's going to be called your opiate agonists. So your opiate receptors, which is going to cause the pain relief. Big one for that's going to be like your morphine. And the other end of that, we also have your opiate antagonist, which is down here. Which we'll talk about that after that though. Also with analgesics, so you have your non-opiate analgesics. So these are your over-the-counter stuff when you're looking at like Tylenol, Advil, Motrin, all those kind of things. Aleve. There's a few different classifications. So you have NSAIDs, which is your non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs. Salicitates, so you'd be like your acetylsalicylic acids and stuff. And finally, acetaminophen, which we talked a little bit about before. One thing unique with acetaminophen is it's pretty hard on the liver and it's processed through there quite heavily. So Tylenol overdoses are actually really hard on the liver, and if you have somebody who's trying to commit suicide with Tylenol, it's usually not a great final couple hours for those patients. And then finally, our analgesics for these, our analgesic antagonists. These are basically going to be these medications that are going to block those receptors, like I showed in that diagram up above, and they're going to block them from being stimulated by opiates. So we find this is obviously prevalent right now with naloxone, so that'd be your opiate antagonist. There are some medications that are circulating now. They're called opiate agonist antagonists. So kind of a bit of a mouthful, but basically it's still a narcotic medication, but its goal is to bind to the opiate receptor to give the pain management that people are looking for, but it also prevents other opiates like fentanyl or morphine from binding to other sites on the on those same receptors, which would cause the respiratory depression. So it kind of works as like a twofold medication where you get the pain management, but it's also going to prevent kind of like the overdose effects of mixing it with other analgesics or other opiates as well. So I'm going to breeze through some of the ones that we're not really super involved with administering. So obviously the number one is a pretty big one with their pain management directives and talking about NSAIDs and contraindications for certain medications, and then obviously naloxone for our opiate antagonist medication. The next group is anesthetics. So these are basically given to kind of numb a certain area. So it provides a loss of sensation. They're short acting, so you got things like the big one that you'll see in the ACP scoped is the lidocaine, and that's kind of like a topical numbing agent. But they can be given systemically, regionally, or locally, depending on what kind of symptom or what kind of response they're looking for. So if you look at something like systemic, that'd be something they use when they put a patient under for an operation. A regional, that might be like a what do you call it there? Epidural, one for pregnancy. So it goes right into the back, and they'll basically put a blocking agent in there, which basically blocks all sensation below that certain point in the spine. And then local would be something like I said, like lidocaine spray on an injury, or we put lidocaine sprays, ACPs, in conscious patients' airways when we're going to intubate them if they're awake. Sedation medications, these are usually given to kind of counteract anxiety. The big group of them is called benzodiazepines. Midazolam is the one you'll see quite frequently with ACPs. There's also diazepam, which is used quite frequently in the hospital. They slow down brain activity, cause a little bit of hypnosis. And again, they're kind of given to kind of give a little bit of a sedentary effect. There's also barbiturates, and then non-barbiturate hypnotics, which we don't really give as far as the pre-hospital setting. Anticonvulsant medications, they're used to combat seizures, and they basically block the cell's ability to depolarize. So certain medications might fall into both these categories. So midazolam we actually give as an anticonvulsant medication as well. So it would fall into that category too. Central nervous system stimulants, these increase the excitatory neurotransmitters, and they'll decrease inhibitory neurotransmitters. So things like amphetamines, things like Ritalin, any other kind of ADD medication will help kind of fit into that category. They have a tendency to cause tachycardia and hypertension, though, as kind of a side effect due to its other effects of the central nervous system. Psychotherapeutic medications, so they block dopamine receptors in the brain. So these are used to treat schizophrenia and depression. And then we have kind of an overshadowing classification, which was split into two other groups down here. Did I put them? Yeah. So I call them central nervous system agents. So they kind of work in the same way as a stimulant, but I think they're a little more specific, or I don't really know how to. You'll see here, there's a lot more kind of ways they work other than just stimulating the upper and downer kind of things. So they can have specific or non-specific agents, which will, affect a specific tissue or grouping of nerves. And they can either work in a stimulant or a depressant action. So, and sometimes, certain medications will do both to different tissues or vice versa. So they have a few different ways they function on the body. So the first grouping is stimulation of the parasympathetic system. So if you remember, this is going to be your rest and digest system. So you're going to have pupil constriction, bronchoconstriction, and then you're going to have some cardiac effects as well. These fall into cholinergic medications. And if you remember from earlier, we talked about acetylcholine. So cholinergic, choline, ACH. I'm trying to think of a good. Usually, you don't see this um, as a medication. This is usually a, I don't want to say terrorist thing, but so nerve agents is a big thing that kind of fall into cholinergic drugs or cholinergic substances, and you also have certain fertilizing compounds like that would be used in industrial farm settings. They can actually cause cholinergic responses as well. So what happens when you're exposed to these chemicals is um, you get kind of a over flushing of the acetylcholine, which causes stimulation of the nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors, and it's going to stimulate all of your cholinergic receptors as well. Depending on the the extent of the exposure, it may act directly or indirectly. I'm surprised I didn't write them in, but you're looking at things like people who have an exposure to a large cholinergic chemical exposure. You're going to be looking at drooling, tearing eyes. You're going to have secretions in the airway, vomiting, diarrhea, urination, slow heart rate. Pupils are going to be constricted, so it's really, you basically leak fluids out of every orifice you can. It's really not a great thing to find. So anticholinergic medications, though, and if you think of like anything like Benadryl, for example, is an anticholinergic medication. They work in the opposition to the parasympathetic system. So you think of somebody who's taking too much Benadryl, they'll have, dilated pupils, or heart rate will increase slightly. It's going to kind of remove the brake pedal, right? When you're looking at the sympathetic system being the gas pedal and the parasympathetic system being the brake pedal. So it's going to be the opposite. Like I have these lists up here, but you're going to have muscarinic cholinergic antagonists. So it's going to block these receptors from being activated. There's a few other agents on here they have as well, which we don't really see in the pre-hospital setting. But they have what's called a depolarizing neuromuscular blocking agent. And this works on the cholinergic or the acetylcholine receptors as well. So a depolarizing blocking agent will actually stimulate depolarization of a muscle cell and then basically paralyzes the patient. So this is one they use in the hospitals called succinylcholine. And then the second grouping would be non-depolarizing blocking agents. And these kind of basically fight to bind to the receptors, and they will not stimulate them. So they just basically prevent anything else from stimulate them at all. And the one that they had listed there was vancuronium. I've never seen that one. So stimulation or inhibition of the sympathetic nervous system is the next category. A sympathomimetic would be something that would stimulate it, and a sympatholytic would be something that inhibits it. So again, in our fashion of breaking up words, so mimetic or mime, it'll mimic the sympathosystem, and lytic, remember, something that breaks down. So I always say like sympatholytic would be a breakdown of the sympathetic system or stopping of it. Remember that the adrenal medulla, so the adrenal gland located on top of our kidneys, is going to secrete our norepinephrine and epinephrine. And then we also have dopaminergic receptors, which are going to stimulate the dilation of the renal, coronary, and cerebral arteries. And then finally, we talked about this a little bit with the cardiac system, but we have adrenergic receptors, which is going to get stimulated from adrenaline or the adrenal hormone, so epinephrine. And the effects it has for these receptors are, again, you have your alpha 1. So I always think of one heart, two lungs for both of these. It's easier for me to think of this. But alpha 1 is going to be your peripheral vasoconstriction. So when we have that anaphylactic shock and you're looking to increase that blood pressure, you do vasoconstriction. So epinephrine for that. Alpha 2 is the kind of, remember, the modulator for alpha 1. So it's going to be the norepinephrine response to kind of, apply the brake pedal a little bit if we've done too much vasoconstriction. Beta 1, so again, one heart, is going to be used to increase heart rate, contractility, automaticity of the heart. And again, we give epinephrine for that as ACPs for cardiac arrest. That might change in the future for PCPs as well. It's still something they're talking about. Then the final one is beta 2. And this is the one we typically give salbutamol for, so our Ventolin spray, right? So this is going to stimulate vasodilation and bronchodilation. And this is obviously the big one we want for asthma attacks and bronchoconstriction. Muscle relaxants is the next category they mentioned in the slideshow. They have a few different mechanisms of action. They can have central action, which would be depression of the central nervous system. Direct acting, which would be directly acting or targeting a muscle to produce relaxation. And then they also can use neuromuscular blockers, which is mentioned up here under the anticholinergic kind of medications. Cardiovascular medications is kind of one of the bigger ones that I wanted to spend a few minutes on, at least, because there are quite a few different groups. So there's a few classifications for their effects, which they kind of use to categorize these medications. When you look at their actual effects on the heart, though, they have what's called a chronotropic effect, and I always think of chronology or clock for the rate. Inotropic, which is the force, and dromotropic, which is the actual speed that the electrical conduction happens through the heart. And then there's another grouping of medication called cardiac glycosides, which we don't really talk too much about, but that's a group if you want to look into it. It exists. The big first category we deal with are what's called antiarrhythmic medications. And the big ones we have are sodium channel blockers, beta blockers, potassium channel blockers, and calcium channel blockers. And these antiarrhythmics are actually split into classes. So based on which mechanism they use to work on the heart, it can either be class 1, class 2, class 3, and then class 4. And it'll always be, so if it's a sodium channel blocking agent, it's going to be class 1. If it's a beta blocking agent, it's always going to be class 2. Potassium channel blockers are always class 3, and then your calcium channel blockers are always going to be class 4. And this kind of works, I don't know if I have room here to draw it. This works on the, remember from the cardiovascular section, remember we have the ions that are being moved across the membrane in the heart to kind of facilitate depolarization of the cells. So when you're looking at, these ions moving across the membrane and how, sodium, say if you're blocking sodium channels, so that would be right here where the sodium goes into the cell. If you're blocking that, it's going to prolong this, right? It's going to delay it. Or calcium channel blocking, if you're blocking calcium from getting brought back into the cell, it's going to prolong this period up here. Potassium channel blockers, so that's the actual pumping of potassium back into the cell. If you delay that, it's going to, prolong that repolarization period. So they all have different effects on how the cell depolarizes and repolarizes. Antihypertensive medications, they reduce stress on the heart. Their sole job is just to, relax the vasculature and reduce blood pressure. They're also used to improve blood flow. Diuretics, they encourage the kidneys to remove more water from the system, reduce blood pressure. And then we have vasodilators. I don't know why I can't really see the last word. But they're used to kind of block the sympathetic system. They also block the ACE system, which we talked about in the last unit as well, or last chapter. So ACE inhibitors, they kind of block that one enzymatic pathway that allows the angiotensin 1 to convert into angiotensin 2. They can also be classified as calcium channel blockers, and then there's finally the angiotensin 2 receptor antagonist, which would kind of be at the end of that whole angiotensin chain there we talked about on the last unit. Anticoagulants and fibro. Oh my god, I always mess this word up. Fibrinolytics, and then blood components. So these would be called antiplatelet agents. They'll prevent platelets from aggregating together. It kind of keeps, they would say the simple way to think about it is it keeps platelets slippery so they don't stick together. It'll stop them from aggregating in a area as well. Anticoagulants, they actually prevent different mechanisms in the blood from working, like fibrin and albumin, from actually identifying or starting the clotting process. So antiplatelets basically prevent clots from getting worse, whereas anticoagulants prevent the beginning or the starting of a clot formation. And the final one would be fibrinolytics, which will actually break down clots. And this is what we see when we have strokes or cardiac or myocardial infarction, sorry. And they give this medication to actually break the clot. Antihyperlipidemic, so these are going to get rid of the extra fats that are circulating in the bloodstream. So the big classification we use is statins, and they actually inhibit the last step of cholesterol production. And this, like these last few ones, are kind of like the ones we don't really do use too often. I mean, we use this one here most often as paramedics for ourselves with caffeine, but as far as treatments, it's not really something we use. But you might see this in patients that have severe respiratory narrowing from an asthma attack or something. The problem is with this treatment is it's non-specific. So along with the bronchodilatory effects, you're going to be dealing with also the cardiac side effects as well. One of the medications or compounds that kind of fall in this category is xanthines. So it's going to relax smooth muscles in the bronchioles, and it also stimulates cardiac muscles to work harder. Again, these are the side effects for the non-specificness of it. And a big one that everyone uses is caffeine. Get through those night shifts. So after this point, I kind of stopped numbering them because they were falling into like kind of very vague categories that I could label these like one after another, and it would take forever to get through this presentation. So I kind of went through the last few ones that are applicable to us right now with our treatment courses that we have and our current directives. So a big one, corticosteroids. So we give hydrocortisone for adrenal crises. It also has anti-inflammatory properties as well. But the big thing we give it for is it basically counteracts the overstimulation of the adrenal secretions of epinephrine. And so this is usually found with people who have thyroid disorders, and it'll be patients that have a previously diagnosed problem with an adrenal crisis. Medications we give for women who are in active labor, oxytocin. So this is given in the in the hospital setting. They give it in smaller doses to kind of encourage labor if labor is kind of slowed down or is being prolonged. In the pre-hospital setting, we can give oxytocin for postpartum bleeding or postpartum hemorrhage. So I said here, it facilitates labor and increases the frequency and the force of contractions. That's during pregnancy. Afterwards, and after the placenta has been delivered, we'll talk about this once we get to the actual skills for this. But if the patient's bleeding quite heavily, we can give oxytocin, which will actually help that uterus contract down, and it'll actually kind of tampen out its own bleeding. So if the uterus can contract on its own and kind of shrink down, it'll actually stop the bleeding on its own, or hopefully stop the bleeding on its own. And the last little group I have on here is phosphodiesterase inhibitors. These are, we've talked about this quite a bit with the cardiac system, but these are used to relax smooth muscles in the corposa cavernosa. And this induces vasodilation. So this corposa cavernosa, this is in the penis. So this is what causes vasodilation and erections. So phosphodiesterase inhibitors are typically given for erectile dysfunction. The big names in these medications are your Viagra, Levitra, Cialis. I'm sure somebody or everyone's seen one of these commercials at some point on TV. It is important to remember, though, we've talked about this before with pulmonary hypertension. We've talked about the pathology behind that last unit. Is they do give this medication to males and females for kind of combating that disease process or that symptom. So it's not exclusively just for male population. So it's definitely something when you're giving other vasodilator medications like nitroglycerin, for example, which we carry, that we ask the patients if they've had any of these kind of medications, right? Because they might be prescribed it for some other reason that we're not thinking of. And you want to make sure it's within 24 to 48 hours, so you don't have a huge drop in their blood pressure from giving these medications. So I know it was a lot. This video is definitely a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. This kind of stuff near the end here, there's not really a whole lot of this stuff that's going to be on the test. The review document I gave, like I said, the test is only 44 questions. Everything that's on the review is pretty much going to hit all the points that are going to be on that test later this week. So if you find anything you have any questions about or something that's maybe unclear, it's likely because we're going to discuss it probably in a greater detail later on in the course, or it's just not really applicable right now at this point. If there is something that's unclear or that you need more information on, you can email me and I'll try to clarify it as much as I can. I feel like between this, the slideshow, and I'll share this document again, there should be enough detail in there for everyone to do pretty well with the test anyways. Again, sorry, this is a little later than I thought it would. We had a few unforeseen illnesses come through the house, so I had to bring our little guy to the hospital, but he's doing better now. And so I just wanted to get this out. It's a little rushed at the end here, but hopefully this hits all the points he needs and you guys have a good understanding of the kind of the basics of pharmacology, and then we can dive a little bit more into detail with patient care theory 2 and 3 in the next few weeks. All right, and I will talk to you in the next week or so. I guess you're with Jeremy for the next few days. So we'll talk soon and have a good day. Thanks, bye.